Hi, and welcome to the Unhinged History Podcast, the podcast where two compulsive nut jobs are going to just mainline history memes. And then we're going to research the back end of the stories behind those memes and join forces and tell each other the stories we've only recently learned. I'm Theresa. I am host one.
I'm Angie. I am host two. And then the last step to that is after we've mainlined the history meme and we've researched the history meme and we've then told each other the story, we then go and make irreverent memes about the meme we originally saw in the first place.
Truth. Truth.
Um, so here's the deal. I don't know how to start. I don't know how to start mine.
Yeah, because it's your turn to go first. We
Yeah, I don't
Rochambeaued and you lost. And I say by Rochambeaued, I mean, really, I
you're
looked at the spreadsheet and I just said, it's you. It's all you. You know who's
yeah,
going
it's
first?
me.
You are.
It's me. Okay, I'm just gonna lead off with I have way many sources. So many sources. So I don't really know what to do with the amount of sources I have and how to give them to you because there's many of them. So I'll just I'm just gonna hit you right off the bat. Historic royal palaces.
Okay. This
Mm-hmm.
could go anywhere.
It really could, yeah. Wondersoftheworld.net.
A
CNN,
dot
I have
net.
a
Okay.
.net, yeah. You'll fit, I may explain why it's a .net later, but believe it or not, a CNN article, history.com, the Anne Boleyn files, which if you get a chance to peruse through there is pretty fascinating. westhorsleypalace.org, and then about 600 other sources about one particular topic within my story that there are many.
All right,
Uh
Legion.
I know, it's truly, yeah, Legion. Just call me Legion today. That's my name. And then for funsies, the 13 Ghosts of the Tower of London, London Walks.
Okay. So when you shared the screenshot earlier and I looked at the bottom and I was like, this says that you've been listening to a Tower of London podcast. You're like, okay, whatever. Nosy
I don't know when
McNoserson.
I listened to it. Whatever. Anyway, I listened to it like
Recently,
on
most
Monday.
recently, the most recent podcast.
Yeah, I listened to this one like Monday. So there's that. So this story comes from the fact that I had another really awesome topic that I wanted to do. Unfortunately, there is not a ton of um n like un understood knowledge about this particular individual. Like in all the places that I looked and all the sources that I could find, what we know sums up to be about 3 paragraphs.
Oh,
So, kind of a bummer there. I'm sure somewhere there's more information, but it's probably not in an easily accessible English format. So, I decided in lieu of that, I would go with a story that I knew had tons of sources. And that's how I was led to be called Legion today. So with all that said, I am going to tell you some of the Tower, or excuse me, I am going to tell you the story of some of the Tower of London's 13 more permanent residents, if you know what I mean.
paranormal residence.
If you will, yes.
Okay.
Right? Okay. So on the north bank of the River Thames in London sits a fortress that since William the Conqueror has been a force to be reckoned with. Um, this is of course the Tower of London, and since it's still spooky month, this is not just an architectural lesson, but a rather unhinged ghost story. Today, we know the Tower of London as the home of the crown jewels. It has those delightful guards. But 1,000 years ago, when it was built by William the Conqueror, you might remember him. We mentioned him in the Bayard Tapestry episode.
Hmm.
I hardly think he needs any sort of introduction, but because honestly, if you've been a fan of history for any length of time, you kind of understand the man behind England, and he has definitely come up a time or two. So, with all that said, a little background on the tower itself. Its official name is Her Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress of the Tower of London.
Would
Or
it
rather,
be His Majesty's now because it has transitioned from mother to
that's what
son?
I was going to say. Rather, I guess it would be now His Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress of the Tower of London. It's simply just called the Tower of London because there are far too many things to go on a
I can't wait for a
envelope there.
non-binary monarch because it'll be there. And then finally, like the acronym will change.
It'll be a whole thing, yeah. Um, in the 1070s, our boy William the Conqueror, fresh from conquering, but still concerned that rebellion can be a thing, he begins to build this gigantic stone fortress in London to both defend and proclaim his status as king. It's pretty safe to say that the commoners of England would have been in absolute awe by its sheer size. They would have never seen anything like it at the time that he built that, right? It's intended to remind everyone of who's in charge, as well as for protection for the royal family and those that live there, as well as there are many other jobs that the Tower of London does. Would you like to know how big the Tower of London is?
I would. I've never been to England, so I have no idea.
Okay, so it sits in an area of 4.9 hectares or 12 acres, so it is a fortress. Its width is 210 meters or 688 feet for those of you speaking English or American,
Yeah,
rather.
American, because there's many
American,
English
yeah.
speakers who understand metric while the rest of us are.
Do not, right? Okay, so its length is 240 meters or 787.4 feet. The width of the moats is 30 meters or 98.42 feet. Its walls are 4.6 meters. That's 15 feet thick at the bottom. And it goes all the way up to 3.4 meters or roughly 11 feet at the top.
Huh.
So you've got some space, yeah?
Some thick walls, two
Yeah.
C's.
I tried to measure it in Costco's, but alas, I could not.
Your American
I'm
knows no
so
bounds.
sorry. Truly, in this particular moment, my love for Costco has it again. The tower itself took around 20 years to build. Masons arrived from Normandy, bringing with them French stone, but most of the actual labor was, of course, provided by Englishmen. It itself has served many purposes over its long life. So far, the Tower of London was the first home of London zoos. In fact, the London Zoo was actually called the Royal Menagerie for
Hmm.
600 years.
Yeah, and that was basically where the
Yeah.
king parked all of his crazy pets and gifts from
Hmm.
other kingdoms.
Yeah. Yeah. It was closed by the Duke of Wellington in 1835. And I think that's kind of a fun fact. It obviously served as a royal resident and a stronghold to protect the royal residents. However, among those royal residents is also the ravens. And ravens are something that speak true to this spooky time of year. I, for one, ravens are the only bird I actually like. So I think they're delightful creatures, but they are known as the guardians of the tower. So basically, there's this legend from right around the time of Charles II. So that would have been the 17th century, but it possibly has much older roots. The basic gist is this: the ravens stay or bolt the tower and the monarchy will crumble. Since the reign of Charles II, there have been at least six in residence on the ground and well cared for,
I love this for them.
right? Some are known to be a bit dramatic and will even play dead if they don't think they're getting enough attention. So they're like really dramatic little house plants. Um, Interesting enough, these ravens, they happen to they've probably been there since time immemorial, but here we go. They do have a spooky connotation to them and are often seen as a bad narrative. And while their story doesn't directly play into the demise of anyone in particular, they do play an adjacent part to one of the more permanent residents in the tower. So I just had to share this because I thought it was so delightful. There is a job called the Raven Master.
Yes.
Where do I apply? Anyway, he is a beefeater and he is dedicated to caring for the tower's ravens. Beefeaters get their unique name from Henry the Seventh, not to be confused with Henry the Sixth, who was imprisoned in the Wakefield Tower of the Tower of London and supposedly around midnight on May 21 of 1471 was murdered at the altar in the king's private chapel. Henry's ghost is believed to haunt the Wakefield Tower. He is said to appear at midnight. I think that's the reason it's believed that that was the time of his murder, because that's the time he shows up.
I mean, okay. All right.
Yeah, right? Okay. If you are a fan, if you've ever seen or read V for Vendetta, then the next ghost will make a ton of sense. It is said that if you happen to be in the council chambers of the White Tower, you can still hear the screams of Guy Fawkes.
Oh,
Mm-hmm. I think for any fan of history, it's pretty safe to say that Guy Fawkes is the most popular and well-known terrorist in history.
yeah.
I'm going to be honest, that sentence wasn't on my bingo card, but here we are.
I mean, if there's anything we can expect, it's adding extra squares to the bingo.
Truly, right? For those that are new to history, Guy Fawkes was one of several men who attempted to blow up Parliament on November 5th in 1605. This would have been the Parliament of King James the First or the Sixth, depending on which country you happen to be sitting in. But King James himself is also the creator of things like the Book of Demonology and the King James Version of the Bible, which I think is really kind of fascinating. But he's a story for himself. He is a poster child for how we should look at history as a whole story and not just a single part. But
Hmm.
anyway, back to Guy Fawkes. So, in a roundabout way, Guy Fawkes is sold out in a real roundabout way. And he's discovered keeping watch somewhere in the middle of the night from November 4th into November 5th. He's keeping watch over the gunpowder kegs, right? At which point he is arrested and held in the Tower of London and most definitely tortured for information for the rest of his conspirators before he was executed. So there's that. And like I said, if you happen to be in the council chamber, there's a very real chance you could hear his screams. How they can tie it straight to Guy Fawkes, I'm unclear, but that's the
Yeah, I
reigning
mean,
belief.
there's been a number of people who've probably been tortured there. So, I mean, I would assume that it's a roll your dice and take your pick.
I mean, unless we're seeing the Guy Fawkes mask screaming at us, but okay, you know? The next ghost is, of course, that of Anne Boleyn, who really needs no backstory, but nevertheless, she's the second wife of the world's biggest D-bag, Henry VIII, the one who broke with the Catholic Church and became head of the Church of England because they told him no once or twice. Things are all cupcakes and flowers until they're not. And just a few short years after Anne Boleyn was crowned, her head was invited to be parted from her body by a French executioner on the Tower Green. I don't know why,
You
but one
say
of the most
invited, and
tragic parts of her story.
I'd not RSVP to that. You send me that, and I'm gonna be like, you know what? Decline.
I don't think it was an invitation you could decline, like when the Mafia Don invites you to dinner, you know?
Watch me.
I
Try
mean,
it.
live your
Try it.
life.
You
Live your
get
life, right?
you know, put a horse head in my bed, and I'm just gonna be like, well, that's uncomfortable. But anyhow, under my
This
weighted
is gonna
blanket.
be really gross to clean up, but anyway. Um, I don't know why, but to me, the part of her story that's so tragic, aside from like, her whole story, is the fact that she stayed in the Queen's lodgings leading up to both her coronation and her execution. So, like, what should have been one of the happiest days, and most definitely the most dramatically tragic days of her life. And that just gets me right in the heart,
Yeah, that's some solid bookends, though.
right? She she was laid to rest in the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, and that means St. Peter in Chains, which is the parish church of the Tower of London. In fact, according to the AnneBoleynFiles.com, After her execution on the 19th of May, 1536, her ladies wrapped her head and body and placed them in an elm chest which once contained bow staves. This chest was then placed in a communal grave with other execution victims in the chapel under the chancel pavement.
A
Like,
queen in a communal grave.
yes,
Wow.
I don't know why, but I didn't know that. And I have read so many books on Anne Boleyn and so many different things. Like, how did I either forget or just never know that? Like, excuse me. But almost 350 years later, there's a soldier making his rounds, and he reported seeing a light burning up in the closed chapel. So he climbs up to the window to see inside, and he said he saw, quote, a procession of knights and ladies led by a headless Anne Boleyn.
I'd
Do with
I'd
that what you will.
no, I'd have browned my pants. Nope.
Right? I have questions because I have also heard stories about her haunting Hever Castle. So,
Maybe she does rounds. Like the first Tuesday she's here, the last Friday she's there. You can catch her in Vegas once a quarter.
yeah. I don't know how haunting works. Like I've never spoken to a specter before, but like I've got questions. Um, there is of course the infamous story of the princes in the tower. I'm hoping you're familiar with that one because
Oh
my
yeah.
mama's heart does not want to tell it.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So they are said to maybe not haunt, but their spirits are definitely stuck there, is the belief. Then there's the lovely Lady Jane Grey, who we all know and love from the Amazon Prime series, My Lady Jane. Sadly, though, she did not live in real life. In fact, she is known as the 9 Days Queen.
Which is super unfortunate.
Truly, basically, for those of you that watched My Lady Jane and thought she survived, what actually happens is she is claims the right of succession after the death of Edward the Sixth. She clearly didn't get to hold on to that claim for long because King Henry VIII's elder daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had both had their status as heirs restored. So Mary, being who she was with the feelings she had Jane imprisoned in the Tower of London and then later executed. So Jane's ghost is said to walk the battlements of the tower. And in the sadly wonderfully charming, at least in the series, Lord Guilford Dudley was also executed, and he can be often seen weeping in the Beauchamp Tower.
Hmm.
Oh, I'm sad they didn't get to stay together in the afterlife, weeping in different towers. Um, Now, I said there are at least 13 known ghosts that haunt the Tower of London, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to give you one more. And honestly, I think I saved quite possibly the best and the weirdest for last. It was my favorite part of this whole story. And that is the story of Sir Walter Raleigh. Please tell me you have some back information on him. Like you have
Nothing
some
reliable.
clue. Okay. So Sir Walter Raleigh has this big adventurous life and this crazy backstory. He's an adventurer, he's a statesman, he's an author, all of these things. Like he is the Renaissance man. You know what I mean? Like he wants to do all the things and he also dabbles in privateering. So all that to say, I'm without going into a whole episode on just him, I'm going to give you the good ghost gossip. And a short lead up to it. So, while Raleigh was a man of many talents and many things, one of the things he was not particularly good at was staying in the good graces of the current monarch. Um, he is known as a favorite of our best girl Lizzie one. So when he secretly marries and then has a child with one of her ladies in waiting, also
Oh.
called Elizabeth, it spells bad news for him, right? At which point, as soon as Elizabeth I hears about it, she immediately arrests mom and dad and throws them in the Tower of London. Their infant son would die of plague, and Elizabeth, in fact, having a heart, does release the mother. Um, I'm unclear if the infant son was with them in the tower or if he was at home being cared for by, governesses or
Auntie,
whatever.
yeah,
Yeah,
somebody.
I'm unclear on that part of the story, but regardless, when he dies, Elizabeth releases her, so she's able to go back home. Sometime later, Raleigh secures his way out of the tower as well. Then, unfortunately for him, Elizabeth I dies in 1603 and King James takes over. And there is like no love between James and Raleigh. Like right off the bat, Raleigh's implicated in what is known as the main plot, which is essentially the plan to oust the king and replace him with James's cousin, Lady Arabella Stuart, who also is known to be a ghost in the tower as well.
Okay. Keeping it all
Um,
in the family.
I know, right? And Raleigh was sentenced to death. However, his sentence is commuted to imprisonment in the Tower of London. And during this particular imprisonment, Raleigh writes extensively. He contributes to his reputation as a writer and even has another kid. So there's that. Um, Conjugal visits, but
I mean,
the
yeah. We
what are you gonna do, right? I know for a fact that while he was a resident there, the tower was redone to house his family, to like house his growing family. So take do that with you what you will. I think maybe his family had the ability to come and go as they pleased, but he couldn't. I don't really know. Um, but he was eventually let out with the idea to win favor and freedom with the king. So Raleigh leaves on a final voyage in 1617 to find, of all things, El Dorado, the mythical city of gold that resides somewhere in South America. As you can imagine, the expedition is a bust.
mm,
And Raleigh's actions during that village or that during that voyage, which include attacking a Spanish outpost, which with whom James was actually trying to have a working relationship with, so this would have been a direct defiance of his orders.
look, he's already got a
Um,
bad relationship with the guy anyhow. This isn't
yeah, like I really don't think he could have done anything right at this point for King James. So like there's that. All of this leads up to him finally being executed in 1618 for breaching peace treaties with Spain. So Raleigh
he
is
leaves the
executed.
tower, he gets brought back to the tower.
Hmm.
Oh, that's your first mistake. Once you walk out of those doors, you don't you leave. You take your family, you hightail it to another country with no extradition.
You would think, right? He is executed in the Old Palace Yard of Westminster on October 29, 1618. In fact, it would be 406 years ago in just a few days.
Wait, wait,
So,
wait, 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 wait. You said Westminster?
mhm.
What's the distance between Westminster and the tower?
I'm unclear. I didn't even think to ask that. I assumed they were moved him for his execution because they wanted it to be a public display.
But then I'm wondering, like, and this is again, we don't have clear lore written out of like, where's the rule book, the employee handbook? You're a ghost. Do you get to go wherever? Are you stuck where you died?
I think you get to go wherever. Because and
Tahiti.
I'll tell you why.
Tahiti.
Yeah. Exactly.
Why would I stick, in some dreary old tower
Yeah,
when
I
my
have
ties are
questions too.
options?
Yeah, okay. You're not wrong, but at his execution, he urges the executioner on by saying, "Strike, man, strike." So even to his last breath, he was working with that delightful bravado. Supposedly, his ghost haunts the Bloody Tower where he was imprisoned, as well as the battlements, which are now known as Raleigh's Walk. Now, to make his story extra special, it's what his wife does afterwards. And all I'm going to say is a quote from Game of Thrones. Oh, the things I do for love. Because, quote, contemporary accounts record that after the head had been displayed for the assembled crowd following the execution, it was placed in a red velvet or leather, likely a leather bag, and presented to Raleigh's widow, Elizabeth Raleigh. She loved him, and evidently his head, so much that she arranged for the head to be embalmed and then proceeded to keep it by her side till her death, which wouldn't happen for another 29 years.
What's that aging meat smell, Grandma? Don't you worry about that.
You say that, right? Those 29 years she spent living at West Horsley Palace, where she lived with her son and his family. So, yeah, that could have been a very real conversation. Don't mind my bag, honey. It's fine. It's just your granddaddy's head.
Yeah, don't play with Papa's eyeballs. Leave those alone.
Stop it, honey. We talked about this yesterday. So, after
Oof.
she dies, like, and the story continues, and this is just wild to me. After she dies, Sir Walter's head is believed to have been placed in a cupboard under the stairs at West Horsley Palace.
That's the equivalent of the junk drawer.
I think so. It reappears again in 1660 when tragedy strikes the family and their
They
son.
open the cabinet and then panic.
No, no, no. I think the son knew they had Raleigh and his wife had at least two children, possibly three, but I couldn't find any corroborating evidence to really suggest three. So they had the one child that died in infancy, and then their son Carew, who reaches adulthood, and he has children. And three of his children died during an epidemic. At which point, the head was buried with the children in the side of the chapel neighboring St. Mary's Church in West Horsley. So then, in 1703, the Raleigh's grave is opened again for a future burial. Um, the William Nicholas, he's residing at West Horsley Palace at the time, records in his diary that the head of Sir Walter Raleigh being dug up with no bones with it and no body to it, nor any room for it. And that just, ugh. So here's the really, really interesting part, and quite possibly my favorite part of this whole story. The house changes hands a couple of times, right? Like, Carew dies, and I think before his death, he sells the house. But it's been around for 400 years at this point, right? In 2018, the people that inherited the house in the years of their since they've inherited, they've started going through rooms, and some of the original things that were there when Raleigh lived there um are still there today.
So they're
And
finding treasure.
they found a red satin velvet leather bag in, or excuse me, satin velvet bag in the attic, and experts are working to see if that is the bag his mummified head was in. Would you like to see a picture?
Um, sure, I guess I needed nightmare fuel.
I mean, I don't have to show you the picture. Oh, because unfortunately, I think I've deleted it.
Oh,
Oh, bugger.
darn.
I
No.
know. Yeah, it's you don't see the head, you just see the bag. But so yeah, that was as far back as, or as most recent as 2018. And I for one just love that the story of Raleigh is continuing in the weirdest way possible.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah. So that's the story of a handful of the ghosts that haunt the Tower of London, supposedly. What's interesting is that also, among those 13 ghosts, a handful of those ghosts are also known to haunt other places. So when you speak about the rule book of haunting, I have questions.
Right.
Like, remember Lady Howard we talked about last year? She could go from one place to another in her carriage. And like, we didn't bat an eye at that because that made sense. But the fact that you could potentially haunt two places at once leaves me with questions.
Yeah. Like validity.
Yes, let's start there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah. So there's my permanent residence of the Tower of London.
okay. Okay. So
Yeah.
I have a story for you that is going to be rather a sharp departure from where you are. I am going to tell you the story of sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome and the origins of the Freddy Krueger franchise.
Wow.
Mhm.
That's a lot. Okay, I'm here for it.
My sources, history.com, how a terrifying wave of unexplained deaths led to a Nightmare on Elm Street by Thaddeus Morgan. Vulture.com, Freddy Lives, an oral history of A Nightmare on Elm Street by Craig Marks and Rob Tannenbaum. LA Times, The Mysterious Fatal Malady Sticking Hmong Men. Sudden Unexplained Deaths Terrorize Laotian Tribesmen, resettled in the U.S. by Evan Maxwell. LA Times, Night Deaths of Asian Men, unexplained by Carl Schrodenberger. LA Times, Deaths of Lao Refugee Puzzle Officials by Bill Curry. And then there was a lecture on YouTube hosted by the La Crosse Public Library titled Sleep Demons, the Hmong, and the Nightmares on Elm Street.
Have you been holding on to this story since you talked about the Hmong?
No,
Okay.
but it came up and it was, I couldn't not.
Okay.
Okay.
This is the story that my husband has been holding in his pocket for like
The longest.
he's been lording this over me. Yeah.
Yeah. So 1984, Wes Craven introduces the world to one of the most iconic horror films, The Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, up until then, we've had Jason, we've had all of these killers with masks, and they haven't said or done much. You know, we've had creature features, right? But Freddy Krueger was different. This creature is a demon or serial killer reincarnated into the nightmares of teenagers who kills teens in their dreams. And it's heinous, it's terrifying. And honestly, little did we know it was actually ripped from actual headlines.
Yeah, that's not good. I tried to show you a bag that could have been the house of Raleigh's head that and you're saying to me I don't want nightmare fuel? Thanks for that.
Um, did I? Okay, here's the problem with me. I don't understand what my triggers are. I just know that they're there. Do I want to see a bag that was not grandma's bowling bag,
Could have
but was
been.
roughly the same size and shape and weight? No, I really don't.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, let's do this.
But I grew up on Freddy Krueger.
I saw approximately, I would say not even 10 minutes of one once, and that was all I ever needed.
I was a toddler watching them with my mother. Now, I wasn't allowed to watch The Simpsons because that was about a child being rude and disrespectful, and they didn't want me to perpetuate that. But horror films for toddlers was applicable.
This makes me feel better about letting my oldest watch Hot Shots Part 2.
You're welcome. I'm
He
here
loved the
just
rubber
to.
chickens.
Now, what a lot of people may not understand or may have forgotten, Wes Craven, he found his inspiration for this groundbreaking horror franchise in an article that was published in the LA Times. Now,
Okay.
he recounted the story of a child refugee from the Cambodian genocide who was terrified to sleep for the fear that he'd be attacked in his dreams and never wake up. Now, let me just put a pin in this right now and say that back in the early 80s, we had a bunch of Hmong refugees, the Hmong being a minority ethnic group coming from the mountain regions of Laos. At the time, reporters did not have the wherewithal and understanding to talk about these people in a way that was accurate. So, Cambodian refugee, they weren't from Cambodia. They might have been refugees in a camp in Cambodia or Thailand, but no, 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 no. So there's some little
Yeah.
disclaimers there. Um, in an interview in Vulture, Craven says he'd read the article in the LA Times about these families that escaped killing fields in Cambodia. They weren't in the killing fields in Cambodia. But again, reporters are going to conflate issues. People are going to people. These things happen. And they manage to get to the US, and then these things are fine. And then suddenly their young son starts having disturbing nightmares. And he tells his parents that he's afraid to sleep, that the thing is chasing him and would get him. So he tries to stay awake for days at a time. And when he finally does fall asleep, his parents thought the crisis is over. And then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was dead. He died in the middle of a nightmare. He was a youngster having a vision of horror, and everyone was denying. That became the central line of the Nightmare on Elm Street.
So, okay, I have to ask, like, this is such an aside, I think, but
Please.
did they determine What did he like have a heart attack? Like from fear?
Stay tuned.
Okay.
This is kind of like, the beginning of that. The article in the LA Times starts with the attacks are all unexplained, fatal, and utterly mysterious. At the time, there's 20 victims, but one of them are young. Apparently, they're healthy men. They're stricken in the middle of the night and they died in agony. Autopsies by some of the best pathologists in the country had been unable to explain the cause of the seizures.
Oh, okay.
Now,
I should have just kept my mouth shut.
I mean, look, I'm here to allow you to interject what others are probably thinking, and then we're going to go deeper, right?
I love this for us.
This isn't an isolated incident. Dozens of Southeast Asian refugees in America died for unknown reasons in their sleep during the early 1980s. And these mysterious deaths were usually among young men in their 20s and 30s, the average age around 33, from the Hmong ethnic group. And it affected a large enough segment of this population that it alarmed health experts.
Okay.
Like disproportionately, these young, healthy men are dying of cardiac events.
Okay.
Okay. Now, episode 77, I covered the story of the Hmong people who were fighting the Vietnam War even years after, like basically up until now. Now, this same group of people, they're separated from their homeland. And for them, this is terrifying. Like it's just been atrocity after atrocity. They can't win for losing. At the time, so more than 30,000 Hmong soldiers helped the US fight communism in the northern highlands where they lived, and they died at a rate that were 10 times the American counterparts during the war. And
Was
then,
it just lack of training?
I
I
mean,
guess that would be a hard thing to understand, I guess.
and they were the ones doing the irregular warfare, right? So I
Right.
don't know. I mean, I think we're comparing apples to oranges. I think one, we were probably positioning them in maybe not the best place. Two, it could have been a lack of training. I mean, I think spin the wheel, take your pick.
Right. That makes sense.
So 1975, the Vietnam War ends, and I'll put that in quotation marks in case you go back and listen to 77. And Laos becomes a communist country. And the new leadership, they're viewing these Hmong people as traitors for the work with the United States. And so many of the survivors flee their homes and after the war become refugees either in Thailand or the US. Now, this is basically a forced migration under the most trying of conditions, says Dr. Katharia associate professor at UC Berkeley and author of Southeast Asian Migration, People on the Move in Search of Work, Refuge, and Belonging. It was a very long and very treacherous journey. The group's troubles didn't end with resettlement, and they are often traumatized by their experiences back home. These people had endured a great deal and had been subjected to a great deal, says. Hmong refugees in the US suffered high rates of poverty, and then this mysterious ailment hits them. Now,
Okay.
like Freddy Krueger's targets in A Nightmare on Elm Street, many of the afflicted were teenagers and young men. And so we start seeing headlines like a mysterious fatal malady striking Hmong men and night deaths of Asian men unexplained, basically the sources I had at the top. And these end up sparking Wes Craven's imagination. And then in one article in 1981, it describes a Hmong man who had relocated from the US from a refugee camp in Thailand. And shortly after settling in his new country, this 47-year-old Yang Ling Thao died in his sleep with his wife beside him in tears. He was the fourth Hmong man to die while sleeping in 9 months, and the 13th Hmong death recorded since 1978, according to the article. Now, there ends up being a total of like 117.
Oh, wow.
All but one of them are men.
Wow.
According to the LA Times article talking about the totality of the deaths, Tom Prendergast of Orange County epidemiologist states, I first learned the possibility last spring, 1980, when I received a call from a reporter in Minneapolis asking whether we had any unexplained deaths among Hmong men. Before I had a chance to check, I got another call from Portland asking the same question. that is when I began to suspect we had a problem.
Wow.
So there's no national database. This is just people making calls at the
Phone
right
calls.
times. Yeah. Now, in Orange County, where, a lot of this reporting is happening, there's only a population of 7,000 Hmong. Of that population, only 13 deaths at the time of the article. Well, at the time of the article, it's estimated that half of those deaths were this mysterious ailment.
Wow.
So, I mean, we're talking 6 or 7, which, when you think of it, isn't a lot, but it
But
is
for
a
a situation like
disproportionate
that,
number.
yeah. Yeah, this isn't just like a basic. This is a really unusual.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
isn't this
Okay.
isn't how things happen. Now, investigators can't find an explanation for any of these deaths. Many communicate Many community members attributed the deaths to chemical nerve agents that refugee soldiers of Vietnam they had been exposed to. But doctors don't validate this claim. Nerve gas doesn't react this way. There's no evidence, says Dr. Larry V. Lumen, the county medical examiner in LA, or the county medical examiner in the LA my brain and my tongue don't want to work together. Said
I thought that
Dr.
the whole time.
Okay, well, I'm glad I'm not alone.
Excuse me.
Said Dr. Larry V. Lumen, county medical examiner in the LA Times article. Secondly, if it's nerve gas, why does it only affect males and why only during the night?
A valid question.
Right? Other Hmong believe that they're being punished by the spirits of their ancestors for leaving their homeland, and their anxiety centered around the quote, inability to do right by your ancestral spirits because you're not there, or because you don't have the right things to perform the right rituals, says Dr. I do think that for many of the Hmong of that generation, the traditional explanation remained salient, if not more salient than other explanations related to cardiovascular problems. Now, there's a doctor, Dr. Vu Den Min. He's a U.S. trained Vietnamese physician who works exclusively with the Hmong population. And he believes that the conditions very clearly cardiac in nature. And they believe that because they have a survivor. There's a man in Seattle who's hospitalized. He was in ventricular fibrillation, Pendergast said. The heart muscle was contracting without affecting the normal beats. It's just kind of quivering. And
Oh,
after
okay.
7 or several weeks of treatment, he developed a typical echocardiogram of people who'd suffered a heart attack. And then when they surgically examined him, he had no signs of cardiac artery disease that the doctors would have expected.
Okay.
So the fatal ailment, later classified as sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, or SUNDS, had been investigated by the Center of Disease Control at length. However, the wave of SUNS deaths among Southeast Asians, particularly the Hmong group, is still unexplained. And that's like from a recent article. Dr. Suggests that years of stress that the Hmong endured could be a factor in the disease. And that was the reflection of the kind of stressors that come from being forcibly removed from a familiar world to a completely alien and sometimes even hostile context,
Okay.
which I get. And then there's a second LA Times article titled The Night Deaths of Asian Men Unexplained. And it documents the deaths from a kind of different angle. In the article, they report on a Japanese phenomenon called pukuri, or snap deaths, basically sudden or unexplained. And these deaths strike primarily men in their 20s and 30s who appear healthy without any indicators of heart disease. There were 80 pukuri deaths reported in Tokyo alone in 1980, and all but 4 of them were men.
Okay.
So,
And that's awfully segregated from the rest of the world numbers as well.
right. Now, it is, there's just so much that it's, so just kind of hold on to that, right? The there's Dr. Ikuo Ishiyama, a specialist in forensic medicine at Tokyo University, who believes that the Bokuri deaths are linked to a sudden coronary artery spasm. And he finds a pattern of heart tissues that he believes demonstrates a depletion of the protein myoglobin. And myoglobin serves as a reservoir for both oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, it seems when I did some recent searches about the disease, it's hard to understand what's happening because we don't, it's not, I don't know if it's not tracked or if it's slowed down or if it's stopped. I mean, I'm unclear. But in total, 117 Hmong refugees died of SUNDS, and all but one were a man. The median age was 33, and they averaged about 17 months in the US, and these deaths peaked in 1981, 1982. One of the things that I found crazy about this is the Hmong have a belief in a dachua, which is a sleep demon. And I hope I said that right. Like I had to have um, my friend from the last episode, like send me an audio file so I could try to say that right because it's not spelled like I pronounced it. Now, for them, it's like a sleep demon or a night terror, maybe an old hag. It's kind of all over that. The elders basically would tell children not to respond if they heard something call out to them, as the demon
Oh,
could
so
follow them home.
like in Appalachia, if you heard it, no, you
Exactly.
didn't.
Yep. So it's interesting to hear that there. And when I was talking to her about it, and I had said, is that something like I could say? Or I know there's other cultures where you don't say the names of the things that call your name and follow you home. And she says, that there are some people who'd refer to that creature as it. Like they may not say it. She's like, but some say it, or they would only say it once, and then they would just use it to refer back to it.
So Voldemort.
Basically. Now, in Laos, it's rare that encounters with the Dachua would result in death, but they seem to get treatment from a shaman. From what I understand, there were several waves of immigration of the Hmong into the US, and it was that first wave of Hmong refugees that suffered from these cardiac events. The later immigration patterns, there's a word, waves, didn't seem to interact with that. And so there's no common thread that they can find. It's not people from the same clans. It's not people who are eating the same plants. It's not like they all had the same herb that they brought home in their suitcase. It's just this is what happened. And it's still unexplained.
That is wild. Because my brain immediately goes to like conspiracy theories, right? Like, did something, obviously not nerve gas or something like that, but were they
Right.
exposed to something else that kind of triggers a psycho, you know,
Well, I mean, so there's,
physiocycle type thing?
and I mean, I'm sure it's stress, right? Because like one of the things I didn't put in my notes, but the Journal of American Heart Association, there was an article that published in 2018, and it was talking about how there are different Southeast Asian illnesses. So I talked about the pakuri in Japan, but it's called Lei Tai in Thailand, pakuri in Japan, um, and then SUNS in the US and China. But like, oh, and then I'm going to butcher this one, but in the Philippines, it's Bangungut. So there's many cultures that have their own variation of this,
Okay.
but it's still just like, what in the world?
And so Wes Craven reads this article, and that's the birth of Freddy Krueger.
Yeah, because he kind of wondered, what is this person afraid of?
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid question.
And so then he applied it to white kids in the burbs.
Okay. That's, I'm so glad that I get to sleep with the light on tonight. I just,
Happy Halloween.
My husband is going to be so pleased to know that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hmm.
I'm doing a public service.
You are out here doing the work, you know?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's actually like that is really, really interesting. Like I'm so curious about the root cause of it.
And I don't think we're going to learn it this side of heaven.
You know, here's the thing, like I placebo is a terrible word to come up with, but you know when you like throughout history we've had these moments of just such a spiritual belief that you make the thing happen, right?
Yeah.
Like wonder if their fear coupled with the things they have seen and the experiences that they have had, it was just like there is no answer for it. It's just something your brain has done.
Well, and what if what if Southeast Asian people, primarily men, have their bodies constructed in such a way that they're not prone to have, but they have a better likelihood of developing that kind of sudden death. And
Yeah.
hypothetically, with high amounts of stress, like, I don't know, surviving a war, their bodies suffer that impact. And then they come to a new culture that is bizarre and foreign and completely alien to them. And they're poverty stricken, which doesn't help reduce stress levels by any stretch of the imagination. And finally,
Yeah.
they clock out.
That is wild. That is, I'm gonna think about this. This is gonna live rent free.
Yeah.
So thanks for that.
You're welcome. I mean, because this is something that I've been like, well, what about this? And what about that? And how can I explore this? And I'm acting like my lack of medical training is actually going to solve this 40-year-old mystery.
You know, sometimes I think that the experts in certain fields forget about the basics, like the very simple things, and sometimes it takes somebody that's not an expert in that field to be like, but what about this? And that's applied like across the board, right? Like with anything. Like I love nothing makes me happier than when an archaeologist digs something up and they don't know what it is, so they ask an artisan and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's a blah blah blah. We've been doing it that way for 6,000 years because."
Or like they had the archaeologist and they were looking at the weird, it looked almost like a neti pot, and a
Mm-hmm.
female archaeologist looked at it and said, it's a baby bottle.
Yeah, yeah, that exact same thing. Like, yes, I love when stuff like that happens because I genuinely think that you spend so much time in one field, in one area of expertise that you forget the rest. So, your common experience is like, oh yeah, wait a minute, that could be a baby bottle.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So yeah, why not? Search it up. Google until your heart's content. And I am
I'm
not going to watch Freddy Kruger tonight. So, yeah.
Let me text your husband. Let me see what I can do for you.
He will not either
Okay. I tried.
because that is love.
You
There, I,
know,
I can't do horror movies.
okay. He's faithful to me enough. I'll let this one go.
You'll let him be faithful to me on this one. Thank
For
you.
this one, you're welcome.
I appreciate I
Yeah,
appreciate you willing to share my husband's fealty.
I'm a giver.
I cannot wait for him to hear this conversation.
Hmm. It's going to be amazing. Um,
Hmm.
and if you too are a giver and you are thinking about giving us a review, you should. Honestly, lean
Yeah.
into it. Both thumbs.
Tell your favorite ghost, use their thumbs too.
Yeah. And on that note, goodbye.
Bye.